This is Sugata Bose. Welcome to the Borders in Modern Asia seminar at the Harvard Asia Center. We are delighted to be resuming our seminar series today. At the outset, I would like to thank Holly Angel, who has worked with me at the Asia Center for close to 20 years. She will be retiring at the end of this month, and I just wanted to take this opportunity to wish her all the best for the future and tell her what a delight it has been to have her as a friend and colleague for nearly 2 decades. I'd also like to thank Tenzin for setting up the technology for this event. I'm truly happy to welcome Joseph McQuade virtually to Harvard. I have had the privilege of reading his wonderful new book in manuscript, Genealogy of Terrorism. Joseph received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2017, and he's currently the Lee Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of Toronto. He's based at the Monk School there. Joseph has a couple of very important articles on the League of Nations and also Rashbihari Bose's Tokyo Journal, New Asia. And now he has come out with this path-breaking book, which I think is essential reading for anyone who wishes to understand the true nature of the British rule of law in colonial India in a broad comparative and connective context. There were many states of exception that were written into colonial law, most of them designed to delegitimize revolutionary violence. Joseph McQuade is currently working on a fascinating project comparing democracy and emergency in India and Burma, or Myanmar. And I was thinking of his current work as I was following the news that is coming out of Myanmar as we speak. But that is his ongoing research. For today, he will be presenting to us on his just published book, Genealogy of Terrorism. So it's over to you, Joseph.
Thank you so much, Professor Bose. So hello, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year as well to those who celebrate it. Hopefully you're all in warmer places than I currently am in snowy Toronto. So I'd just like to begin by thanking the organizers of the Borders in Modern Asia seminar series at the Asian Center for hosting this talk, especially Holly and Tenzin, who I know have put a lot of work into putting this together. And a very special thank you to Professor Sugata Bose for very kindly inviting me to participate and for very generously reading the manuscript and for being part of this conversation. So today I'll be discussing my new book, A Genealogy of Terrorism, Colonial Law, and the Origins of an Idea, which came out this past November with Cambridge University Press. And so the goal of today's talk is really to provide an introduction to the book, which I hope will provide enough information for a bit of a discussion afterwards and perhaps provoke some questions or thoughts from the audience as well. So to begin, I'll say a little bit about how I became interested in this particular topic. As my first book, this project grew out of an evolving set of interests in South Asian studies, imperial surveillance, and the growing field of global history. My goal in the early phases of this research was to think about how imperial networks of surveillance and espionage could be reframed through the lens of Ranjit Guha's famous term, the prose of counterinsurgency, which he uses to describe the depoliticization of peasant rebellion in 19th century India. So working with supervisors and professors like Ritu Birla, Amitav Chowdhury, and Tim Harper, I became interested in critically thinking through the archive of the 20th century imperial surveillance state in a way that could make sense of a new prose of counterinsurgency that is very familiar to us today in our current context, that being the prose of counterterrorism. Looking at colonial archival sources from the 1920s and 1930s, I found that the language of terrorism was extremely widespread in descriptions of the revolutionaries who sought to use violence to overthrow the colonial government in India. Now, this in and of itself is not surprising, but what intrigued me was the relative absence of this language in documents and speeches produced just during the previous 2 decades of the 1900s and the 1910s. The term terrorism does still appear in these older records and is quite prominent in discussions, for example, of Russian anarchists during the same period. But the term is really overshadowed by other labels such as seditionists, revolutionaries, and especially in the Indian context, this term political dacoits, which I'll return to in a moment. So in looking at these sources and in finding some of these kind of nascent patterns that were appearing to emerge, it raised a question for me that has kind of at least three layers to it. So the first layer to this is, was this shift in language that I was observing representative of a genuine shift in how political violence in India was being understood, described, and policed by contemporaries within the period? Second, if so, was this shift a deliberate rhetorical strategy, or was it simply an unconscious result that was coming through a changing political or historical context? And finally, if the shift was deliberate, how did it connect to the deeper history of a colonial prose of counterinsurgency, which we've learned about through the writings of Guha and others, or to the global history of terrorism as a category of international criminality, transcending the borders of colonial India? So these were the main questions underlying the archival research that I conducted throughout my doctoral studies and postdoctoral fellowship, and these are the questions that my book kind of sets out to answer. So in terms of whether or not this shift in language was genuine, or that there actually was something to the trend that I thought that I was observing, I wanted to make sure that my research encompassed as wide an archival base as possible so that I wasn't basing my argument on a small sample of texts that perhaps may have simply skewed the representation of certain terms over others. So in some ways, this was the most straightforward aspect of the project because it basically just entailed reading through as many relevant archival documents as possible. So this included legislative documents, debates in various provincial and national legislative councils, debates in British Parliament, actual wording of laws and descriptions of laws, and private correspondence describing the passage of these laws, as well as newspapers and memoirs and other sources like this. And so what I was looking for was the frequency of terms like terrorism, terrorist, in cases where anti-colonial revolutionaries were being described, and specifically making sure that I was looking for it kind of in cases where we were seeing a similar phenomenon before and after the First World War, but where a different language was being used rather than simply two different phenomenons. So in doing this, what I found was that, yes, this did confirm the kind of initial supposition, and there did indeed appear to be a sea change in language, really, that was occurring in the 1920s and that actually seemed to be coming on quite quickly during the early 1920s. It was actually a fairly marked shift that I noticed. So right up until this major report drawn up by the Sedition Committee at the end of the First World War, the term terrorism is mainly used to describe a specific phenomenon called the terrorism of witnesses, whereby revolutionaries would assassinate informants, police spies, witnesses, or other members of the imperial policing apparatus. And so this was a very specific use of the term that was really describing to this actual process of terrorizing a specific subset of individuals who formed these kind of these key links within the colonial surveillance and system of law and order, the individuals who are operating at what Chris Bailey has described in a phrasing that I like as the point of intersection between political intelligence and indigenous knowledge, where colonial rule was at its most vulnerable. So in the speeches and legislation of the 1920s, the term terrorism is much more prevalent than it is in these earlier documents, and it's used to describe a much wider range of activities than just the so-called terrorism of witnesses. In his justification for the Bengal Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1925, Governor Lytton, the governor of Bengal at the time, declared that, quote, the growth of a terrorist group is incompatible with the existence of any government, whether Swaraj or not. So this emerging idea of terrorism as a noun, the terrorist, is also something that is not wholly absent from earlier discussions in India, but it becomes noticeably more common in the 1920s. In the discussions of the 1920s and 1930s, the term terrorism is deployed far more frequently than in the debates surrounding any earlier legislation. And in these discussions, the term is frequently used to draw a line between the so-called legitimate politics of the nationalist movement and the so-called illegitimate politics of the terrorists. So this brings me to the second question. Was this shift in language that I was observing deliberate? We can see in earlier discussions within the historical record that there does seem to be a desire to come up with a term that can adequately differentiate revolutionaries from earlier sorts of criminal categories. And so one of the discussions I looked at was the discussion surrounding the term political dacoits. So dacoit essentially is a term referring to bandits. And so this idea of political dacoits was, as it was defined in a Government of India publication in 1916, it was defined as, quote, implying dacoities committed by men not ordinarily of the professional criminal classes as part of a seditious campaign. So despite the widespread usage that it has at the time, there were officials like Lord Hardinge, who was the Governor General of India for part of this period, who viewed the term with some suspicion. So at a meeting of the Imperial Legislative Council at Shimla, Hardinge announced that he failed to, in his words, to see any difference between an ordinary dacoity and a political dacoity. These are both crimes of a heinous description, while the perpetrators, be they Bhadralok or others, are all criminals of equal degree, end quote. So perhaps because of this predominantly Bhadralok or middle-class social basis of the revolutionary movement, which differentiated it from earlier, more easily demarcated criminal identities, such as thugs or criminal tribes, there was this kind of tension in language, and there was this kind of difficulty of knowing exactly how to refer to these people because they didn't fit the earlier colonial typologies that viewed crime as being predominantly a hereditary, having a hereditary basis. And this is something that has its own very interesting global history. If we look at the writings of social reformers in England during the same period, we do see that there are echoes of this same language in the way that they are policing so-called hereditary criminals in England as well. But it takes on a very distinct usage in India, where it's used to refer to, especially the most famous example being the so-called criminal tribes, but also including others such as thugs and pirates and fanatics, who I'll also talk a little bit about later as well. So after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, communism became a category of special concern for authorities, and we do see quite a bit of kind of intermingling and slippage and overlap between communist revolutionaries and the so-called revolutionary terrorists in this period, with many of the revolutionary groups that had previously not necessarily been specifically on the political left moving towards the left. So the Dhaka Anushalan Samiti is one example of this, as well as if we look at figures like Bhagat Singh from the late 20s, early 30s, we do see much more of this kind of left-wing basis for their politics. But in the case of both colonial officials and left-wing revolutionaries at the time, there is an attempt to make a clear distinction between communists and terrorists. And so in H.W. Hale's book, Terrorism in India, 1917 to 1936, which was a key study of the revolutionary movement that was produced by and for the Intelligence Bureau at the time. The author makes a sharp distinction between terrorism and communism and omits communism entirely from his narrative. In differentiating them, Hale remarks that terrorism, quote, as distinct from other revolutionary methods such as communism or the Gardiner movement, may be said to denote the commission of outrages of a comparatively individual nature, end quote. A similar distinction was made by the renowned Indian communist M.N. Roy, who criticized what he called sporadic terrorism as being just as useless, in his words, as constitutional nationalism. In his 1924 article, Appeal to the Nationalists, Roy wrote, quote, "It is no more possible to win national independence by killing a number of officials than by a series of reform acts passed by the British Parliament," end quote. In reality, the line between communists and terrorists was not always so clear-cut, with Roy himself being involved in a number of plots to smuggle arms into India to be used by those that were designated as terrorists by the colonial government. So this now brings us back to that same piece of emergency legislation that I mentioned before, the Bengal Criminal Law Amendment Act from 1924, from 1925, first introduced as an ordinance in the fall of 1924. In the private discussions and public pronouncements that surrounded the passage of this legislation, we can see the most explicit attempt to deliberately shift the discussion from what were considered political crimes, such as sedition and political dacoity, towards the supposedly apolitical label of terrorism. Cognizant of the fact that such a display of executive authority, especially during the very tumultuous time of the war, especially following the very tumultuous time of Gandhi's non-cooperation movement in the early 20s, the Governor General, Lord Reading, used very careful language in drawing up the draft of the legislation and of his public pronouncements surrounding it. So, although earlier repressive laws that were directed against the same revolutionary movement explicitly used the term sedition, such as we can see in the what was called the Sedition Committee report, Reading specifically said that the Bengal Criminal Law Amendment Ordinance would not give the government any extraordinary powers, quote, to deal with sedition, with industrial movements, or with communal disturbances, even though they may menace the maintenance of order. He goes on to say, it is aimed solely at the secret criminal conspiracy which has terrorism as its object or method. The proclamation that the government ultimately circulated in the Gazette of India in October of 1924 made repeated references to the terrorist movement of Bengal and emphasized this term terrorism and terrorists more than any previous legal proclamation had done up to that point. What's interesting, though, is that this was actually not the case in earlier drafts of the same proclamation, in which actually the term terrorist and terrorism doesn't show up once. The original draft only used the term revolutionaries, but in editing the draft, the British Secretary of State, Sidney Olivier, bracketed and underlined Reading's use of the word revolutionary and replaced it with the word terrorist in red ink. Writing back to Reading, Olivier recommended making these changes throughout the document, and so Reading replied, and I'll quote here, "I quite appreciate that they made it slightly easier for you to defend in Parliament than England, although the words revolutionary and revolutionaries used by me are perhaps more appropriate in India. But I understand the difficulties you would have in any event to meet, and did not attach sufficient importance to adhering to my own language, and therefore changed these terms throughout as you desired." So we can see through this correspondence, as well as through other writings and other documents that I won't get into all of them here, but we can see that this emergence of terrorism as the defining label used in subsequent legal and political pronouncements on the Indian Revolutionary Movement really needs to be understood, at least in part, as a deliberate and calculated attempt to make emergency measures both palatable within Reading's own words to the British Parliament, as well as to politicians within India. Unsurprisingly, this kind of linguistic maneuver didn't do much to convince Indian nationalist politicians and newspapers, many of whom interpreted the ordinance as a direct assault on anti-colonial politics. Although apologists for government action maintained that the ordinance could not target nationalist politicians, as it clearly stated that the law was directed against terrorism and terrorism alone, the prominent Bengali politician C.R. Das referred to the ordinance as an obvious attack on the Swaraj party due to the growing strength of this party, which he claimed was becoming unbearable for the government. So this is the domestic political context in which the term terrorism acquires its widespread usage, a context in which repressive policies that were in practice also directed against nonviolent nationalist politicians, as well as other kind of mainstream politicians who didn't necessarily advocate the use of violence, but weren't necessarily totally part of the Gandhian kind of more strict nonviolent movement. Where these kinds of policies were framed as measures designed purely to address the threat of a crime called terrorism that stood entirely separate from so-called legitimate methods of political mobilization. So this now brings us to the third and final question that I raised earlier. How did this shift in language connect to the deeper history of a colonial prose of counterinsurgency as elaborated by Guha, or to the global history of terrorism as a category of international criminality? Central to this question is the insight provided by Priya Satya's work on colonialism in the Middle East, in which she argues that how states see or don't see is a matter intimately connected to cultural history. In other words, colonial perceptions and colonial policies are best understood as mutually reinforcing, each shaping the other in tangible, if sometimes oblique ways. The broader role of fear, paranoia, anxiety, and other subjective negative emotional states in the history of colonial governance has attracted increased scholarly attention in recent years. The old image of the colonial administrator as a cool and detached bureaucrat has been replaced by the recognition that colonial knowledge was less a rational matrix of objective truth than a piecemeal web constructed out of imperfect, uneven, and often fictitious interpretations of local customs and cultures. From this perspective, attempts to capture or exterminate the thugs, dacoits, pirates, and fanatics of the 19th century highlight both the paranoia of colonial officials seeking to establish control over territories and peoples they didn't understand well on the one hand, and the role of brute force in extending British control over the subcontinent through a coercive apparatus of legal and military control on the other. This seeming paradox, or this paradoxical relationship between anxiety and violence, is less counterintuitive than it may seem. In many instances, moments of profound imperial insecurity could translate into spectacular outbursts of violence, as we see, for example, with the blowing of Sikhs from the mouths of cannons following the so-called Kuka outbreak of 1872, or the famous massacre of hundreds of unarmed protesters at Amritsar in 1919. Furthermore, theorists of violence such as Hannah Arendt contend that violence and power should be understood as oppositional rather than equivalent. According to Arendt, power relies on consent or legitimacy, whereas violence acts as a tool of coercion in instances where true power is lacking. And we can think also of this kind of quote that circulates online. I forget what the origin of it is, but this idea that of power as the last resort of the incompetent. Or violence, rather. Violence is the last resort of the incompetent, but kind of reframed as kind of violence as the last resort of those lacking kind of other coercive means of achieving their objective. This can be understood also as kind of relating to what Ranajit Guha has called dominance without hegemony. And this is where we can kind of understand the paradoxical nature of this relationship. As we'll see, as we see kind of through the current work, through my book, it's often at the times when officials feel most insecure about their own lack of knowledge regarding the activities of revolutionary organizations that they resort to the most extraordinary measures to contain the threat. At the same time, it's important to not exaggerate this point. While it's true that colonial rule was not as monolithic or stable as some would argue, it was nonetheless a system of government that, in the words of Partha Chatterjee, was at its core absolutist and authoritarian. While officials may have felt anxiety at the prospect of secretive conspiracies lurking at the margins of imperial authority, the consolidation of British power throughout the subcontinent over the course of the 19th century ensured an increasingly expansive capacity for extreme brutality in both quotidian and spectacular forms. An inability to identify individual perpetrators of real or imagined offenses gave rise to a reliance on collective forms of punishment that indiscriminately targeted the innocent and the guilty alike. Similarly, a rule of colonial difference and the supposedly scientific theories of racial difference that bolstered this ideology from the mid-19th century onwards provided the rhetorical justification for treating colonial subjects in ways that would have been unthinkable in metropolitan Britain. Categories of extraordinary legal standing, such as thugs, pirates, criminal tribes, fanatics, and later terrorists, can kind of be thought of as demarcating the outer limits of this colonial difference by providing oppositional figures beyond either law or politics against whom colonialism could assert its legitimacy and expand its jurisdiction through the exercise of emergency sovereign power. Categories such as the pirate and the fanatic are in this way precursors to the modern phenomenon of terrorism, but only insofar as they provide us with the means to assess earlier iterations of a colonial state of exception that met challenges to its authority with extrajudicial emergency measures designed to establish a clear monopoly on violence and to protect the commercial interests of empire. In identifying the threat of Thuggee, for example, as an India-wide conspiracy of Kali-worshipping highwaymen and murderers within the 1830s, William Sleeman, who was one of the main architects of the so-called anti-thug campaigns, provided one of the earliest articulations of an imperial right to exercise control beyond the narrow enclaves and corridors of colonial jurisdiction, instead looking at a kind of British rule that would encompass, in his words, every country in India, which could now be considered as under the protection of the supreme government. So under the mandate given to it by what Sleeman called the laws of humanity and of nations, the East India could now reclaim, quote, these fugitive thugs from every state in which they may seek shelter, end quote. What we can see then is that time after time, the new threat posed by each successive target of colonial anxiety was said to justify greater executive powers, the imposition of new emergency laws, or the abrogation of the ostensible liberal rule of law on which British imperialists in India claimed to ground their moral authority. Operations of so-called pacification undertaken with the goal of rooting out secretive groups of thugs, criminal tribes, pirates, or fanatics were typically directly linked to the project of establishing British sovereignty in and around the Indian subcontinent by land and by sea. In this process, colonial administrators, judges, soldiers, police, and scholars produced, repurposed, and recycled a set of tropes and stereotypes portraying certain groups of Indian men as barbaric, violent, cowardly, secretive, superstitious, credulous, or fanatical, as the case may be. In drawing upon this reservoir of cultural stereotypes, various strands of colonial knowledge provided a strategic rationale for extraordinary legal measures that could then extend the reach of colonial rule. Now, as we move past this period of the passage of the Bengal Criminal Law Amendment Act and into the period of the 1930s, the category of terrorism begins to take on a similar role in the articulation of international authority in institutions like the League of Nations, as the book explores through an examination of the 1937 Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Terrorism. In the debates surrounding this convention, which is really the first major international initiative to actually provide an international legal definition of terrorism, we can see how national representatives framed their ideas about terrorism as a new and particularly dangerous form of global criminality, what they called a world crime that threatened not only the governing structures of an existing political regime, but even the very notion of civilization and humanity itself. Of central importance to this project was the responsibility of states to effectively exert sovereign control within their own territory. Historian David Armitage argues that, quote, perhaps the most momentous but least widely understood development in modern history is the long transition from a world of empires to a world of states. In the formation of the League of Nations, this process came to be institutionalized in the formal structures of international relations. Whereas 19th century imperialisms retained a dynamic and expansive quality that allowed for shifting territorial claims and balance of power politics, the international system inaugurated at Versailles sought to legitimize an interstate system wherein sovereignty rested within the fixed territoriality of geographically contiguous nation-states situated within a bounded global space. And so just to kind of expand on that a little bit, essentially, if we think about 19th century imperialism, is very much the imperialism of the frontier, whether we're looking at colonialism in the Americas, the so-called scramble for Africa, or the kind of encroachment of imperial powers in Burma, for example, in Southeast Asia, in India. It really is about this kind of expansion. And what we're seeing after the Versailles Treaty is that essentially that expanding frontier, as one historian put it, has now become bounded by this kind of global arena in which we are beginning to move towards the kind of world that we live in today, where pretty much all territory on the map is claimed by some state or another. And so those borders between the various states, instead of being these kind of dynamic borderland spaces, become these very strict and regimented borders that divide sovereignty between different states. So this process contributed as a result to an increasing international regulation of movement through the creation of passports and other forms of documentary identification. In addition to the monopoly on violence claimed by emerging nation states, modern governments have also claimed what John Torpy has called a monopoly of the legitimate means of movement, making themselves the final arbiters for determining who or what may cross these fixed borders. And I mean, this is also something that's, we can really see this even today if we think about the discussions happening with border closures and with the spread of COVID-19. And this idea of kind of globalization versus hard borders. A lot of this is really, we're kind of seeing the groundwork for this being laid in this interwar period of the early 20th century. So for dissidents and critics within the period, there was a kind of sinister aspect to this division of the globe into a bounded sphere of neatly abutting zones of state sovereignty. A quote that I find particularly interesting, and one of the ones that I actually, with which I actually opened the book, is by Josiah Wedgwood, who was a member of Parliament for the British Labour Party in the 1920s. So, writing in his memoir about a specific incident in which a Indian revolutionary named Savarkar was claimed out of French territory after escaping from a British vessel, and kind of triggering this whole conversation about political asylum and international law. So writing about this incident, but also with kind of a mind to the wider picture, Wedgwood said, and I'll quote this at some length, authority is, it seems, at one all the world over, and we must recognize that there is now no longer the least illogical loophole of escape for a fleeing man on this earth or in its waters. It is merely a question of which uniform shall arrest him. In old days, there was always some leakage, some chunk of escape between the machineries of different nationalities. But the nets are drawn closer now. Daily, the elaborate international system for maintaining the status quo becomes more perfect, and from it, there is no appeal. The fugitive, assassin or patriot, avatar, or that weird monster, the anarchist of the newspapers, whatever he may be, can find no corner of the globe to shelter him. And the only doubt is under which precise code of regulations he shall be judged, punished, and put away. End quote. In the same way that the 19th century criminalization of thugs, pirates, and fanatics paved the way for the expansion of British rule through the Indian subcontinent, the interwar period saw an increasingly standardized script regarding the idea of global terrorism, which went hand in hand with the shoring up of the authority of territorially bounded nation states and empires And if we think about the rhetoric surrounding the global war on terror today, again, we can really see how it's this earlier period that is laying the groundwork for these kind of universalized approaches towards terrorism, so that if we take the example, for example, of the global war on terror, and we think about how a variety of different conflicts, whether in Kashmir, in Xinjiang, in Chechnya, how all can be kind of folded into this universal logic of a global war on terror, where the enemy is this kind of abstracted jihadist figure. Whereas when you actually look at any of those conflicts or any of those issues at the local level, there are so many specific contextual local factors that are actually going into shaping the dynamics on the ground. And so that we can kind of see this disjuncture between the universalizing global rhetoric versus the actual local circumstances. So a common theme animating the arguments of representatives from a variety of countries within this League of Nations debate in 1937 is that terrorism was not to be understood as political violence directed towards a particular political system or government. So the Romanian delegate, Mr. Pella, for example, admitted that there was a great deal of difficulty in drawing a distinction between acts of terrorism and political crimes, because it was almost universally agreed that political offenses were not, quote, of an antisocial character and did not shake the foundations of social life. Because political offenses were of a specifically anti-governmental character, they conflicted only with the principles of quite special morality, namely principles which were often connected with the form of government of each state and varied from one country to another. It was therefore advisable that other states should not intervene in questions which concerned the political life of a given state, end quote. So according to Pella, if a state was helping with the repression of political offenses directed against the interests of another state, that participation would be regarded as an interference within the latter state's internal affairs, and hence an infringement on its sovereignty. And again, this is something that is echoed in those conflicts that I just mentioned. You know, if we think about how the Chinese government, for example, speaks about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, it's very much within this rhetoric of it being an internal matter. It's the same in India with Kashmir, where Kashmir is seen as an internal matter to be resolved by the Indian government rather than a matter of international law. So at the same time, for Pella, state sovereignty was not a sufficient justification for non-interference when it came to repressing acts that he called terrorism. And this is where we can see this kind of very muddy distinction being introduced here, because if the act of political violence constituted terrorism in his view, then these acts, in his words, did not merely endanger the order of a given state, but social order in general. So he says that when a political offender or movement expressed their will in, quote, acts of barbarity and terrorism, the non-collaboration of states in suppressing these acts would constitute then, in his words, a flagrant repudiation of the duties of international solidarity. And so this is really a central tension that we see within these debates, this distinction between states regulating internal political matters themselves, whereas also having a responsibility to police acts of terrorism. And we can maybe get into that a little bit more in the Q&A, because what's also interesting there in defining terrorism is that the Convention defines terrorism specifically as acts of violence against the state, which kind of inherently means that it is a political crime. But there's also a discussion of exempting political crime from definitions of terrorism because of the right of political asylum. And so it becomes a very circular argument that becomes very difficult to kind of cut through. And so, in other words, the diplomats at Geneva are speaking of a kind of international solidarity, so they call it le système de la solidarité des États, that existed between the disparate states of the world, and that ensured that the threat of terrorism should be dealt with through a unified and concerted response at the level of the international. So By examining the evolution of this prose of counterterrorism at a range of scales, from the provincial in Bengal to the international at Geneva, this book emphasizes the fact that India was only one node, albeit an important one, in the production of terrorism as a global category of criminality. The title of the book, A Genealogy, rather than The Genealogy of Terrorism, is not accidental, and I don't claim to be providing a complete picture of this multifaceted phenomenon. Still, my hope is that this book, and indeed this discussion, will help contribute to a larger conversation aimed at historicizing the concept of terrorism and the relationship of this term to longer histories of colonialism, surveillance, and international law. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph. That was a very fine summary of what is, in fact, a complex book. And as you know, and I will share this in public, I believe that your book is an absolutely brilliant deconstruction of the colonial prose of counterterrorism. And if I had a little bit of sort of a questioning of your methodology, it was that, what would your argument look like if you included the counterpoint of revolutionary thought? Those of us who have grown up in Bengal still, find it, very hard to understand the, contemporary discourse on terrorism, because if I may put it bluntly, we seem to have grown up worshipping quote unquote terrorists. After all, there were 18 revolutionaries, as we would call them today, who were arrested in October 1924, including Subhash Chandra Bose, under Regulation 3 of 1818. And it was only later that charges were brought against them when they were in Mandalay jail in Burma under the new amended Bengal Criminal Law Act. And so, the word terrorism, or the appellation terrorist, did not really have a pejorative connotation for quite some time. It's only now that if you find a book which uses the old term terrorist instead of anti-colonial revolutionary, that there will be something of an outcry. So what happens if one looks at both? Just move away from the focus for a moment, which is the focus of your book, on the colonial prose of counterterrorism, and include, some of the ideas that were circulating among revolutionaries about the method of their struggle.
Sure.
And I would like to invite those who want to ask questions to put in their questions on the Q&A, and I'm sure we'll be able to answer those. Yeah. Go ahead, Joseph.
Sure. Yeah, thank you very much. So this really is one part of it that is really interesting, is that looking at the way that especially the Indian National Congress deals with with revolutionaries. And I think that in the last point that you were making as well was a really important point, this idea of terrorism as method in terms of how it was conceived at the time, is, I think, a very important point, because if we look at the writings of Sachindranath Sanyal, for example, he specifically says, he doesn't deny using terrorism, but he says we don't use terrorism for terrorism's sake. We use terrorism against the terrorism of the colonial state. And similarly, Rash Bihari Bose describes when he uses terrorism, he's really using it to describe state terrorism. But in terms of thinking about it as method, you're obviously absolutely correct that this is really kind of getting at a central debate that's happening within the nationalist movement between Gandhi and kind of his faction, and then other major figures like Subhash Chandra Bose, and that it is certainly a mistake to view that line between the two of them as being so clear cut in terms of one group being kind of terrorists and one group being these, you know, peace-loving freedom fighters. Because what we also see is that for many of those who were the revolutionaries, who were kind of referred to as the terrorists, that for some of them, for example, they gave the nonviolent movement a try during the initial phase, during the 1920s, and they said, okay, we'll back Gandhi during non-cooperation. He's promised, you know, Swaraj within a year, so we'll go along with that. And it's after the failure of that movement, after the repression by the British government, that they then revert back to using kind of violent tactics. Some of them go on to participate in provincial legislative councils, others boycott the legislative councils. So certainly there is a lot of interplay and quite a bit of muddiness really there. And so this is kind of part of what I'm interested in, is how this discourse of terrorism today, but also kind of at that high official level within the period in question, is really used as a way of kind of cutting through that complexity and actually kind of reducing those who are open to using violence as kind of one tool within a larger toolbox towards their cause of political independence. How this label is used to kind of roll those people into this one label of simply being terrorists. And so, yeah, I think that that's the focus of the book is really on that happening. And at the official level, I do see that happening in a deliberate way. And I do see the term terrorist really having that kind of the same kind of pejorative connotation that it does have in today. And this is also shaped, it's worth noting too, also shaped specifically by Britain's understanding of itself in relation to Tsarist Russia at the time. This is a very important thing too, where because there is this complex relationship in terms of how British reading publics are actually seeing the Russian terrorists as being almost romanticized in a way, because they're fighting against the authoritarian Tsar, who's kind of hated by the British public. And so it's true that certainly in that earlier, especially in that earlier period of the first 2 decades, the 1900s and 1910s, the term terrorist there, like I mentioned, is actually more about methods, is more about kind of terrorizing witnesses or using intimidation. Whereas it's really in that later period that we see that it's being used to very specifically actually set apart the so-called terrorists from those who are kind of part of the Gandhian faction. And then just a final point on that in terms of kind of where the more radical members of Congress, or the more radical members of the kind of that are kind of occupying that space between the so-called terrorists and the kind of mainstream politicians, where they're kind of sitting in that is that they essentially, these laws are essentially using this label of terrorism to kind of mark out these, what are seen as the outer fringes of the nationalist movement, in order to try to justify measures that then are used, exactly as you say, to actually then police these people who are kind of in that middle area, where there may be, saying that their methods are open to using violence, but they're not actually committing these kind of revolutionary conspiracies themselves. And so this is where that category becomes kind of useful in terms of the way that the colonial government is using this legislation for actually a broader basis than what it is claiming, while also being able to uphold this kind of language that is increasingly necessary after the Peace of Versailles and after this kind of legitimization of the language of self-determination, which of course isn't viewed as being applicable in the colonial settings, but does still have a certain international moral legitimacy to it. There's a very strong effort, I think, to remove that legitimacy from opponents of colonial rule, including people like Subhash Chandra Bose. And so by kind of applying this label, which is becoming increasingly of concern in these international laws, like we see in the League of Nations, by using this label of terrorism that has that kind of global connotations to it, it does also become a way then of being able to kind of justify the continued suspension of political rights within India.
To continue the conversation, that the Gandhian civil disobedience and the revolutionary movements were quite closely imbricated in certain regions. I mean, if you think about Medinipur district in the early 1930s, it was a bastion of the Gandhian movement of the early 1930s, but it also witnessed the assassination of 3 British district magistrates in that same period. In fact, I read a letter from J.M. Peddy, the first of the British district magistrates to be assassinated, saying that there ought to be a few more shootings, otherwise the collection of taxes will be extremely difficult. And he clearly could not have imagined that he himself would become, an early victim of the next round of shooting. So there was no sort of clear separation. What you've also been able to, I think, show us is the temporal threshold of the 1920s. We tend to forget that the world of nation states in which we live is just about 100 years old. And even though the League of Nations Convention didn't come until 1937, it's in the early interwar period that you had, some of the major discursive shifts in the language of terrorism, and we are still living with it, of course. And it's amazing that now in 2021 we seem to be so obsessed with not allowing foreigners to interfere in the internal matters of India. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs has been extremely busy responding to tweets on the farmers' movement by Rihanna and Greta Thunberg and Meena Harris. And of course, there's also an attempt to tar the farmers' movement with the brush of terrorism. And what's more, there's a new regulation that has been issued to all Indian central and state universities and educational institutions, that they cannot hold Zoom webinars or host them if they touch on the internal matters of India, which would practically be everything to do with India, without getting prior permission from the Ministry of External Affairs. So this whole business about internal matters and then their connection with the question of sedition, if not terrorism, seems to have gained a new breath of life 100 years on. And you clearly showed that there was a shift taking place in the early 1920s to the mid-1920s.
Yeah. The other, another interesting kind of recent term is this idea of anti-nationals. And this is also something that, interestingly, is used to describe the revolutionary terrorists as well, as actually being the attempt is really to kind of frame them as actually being against the Indian nation, because they're said as kind of holding back progress through their actions. And so it's this kind of inversion where those who are actually explicitly nationalist are viewed as kind of being anti-nationalist, in the sense that they're seen as holding back this progress. And this then also becomes this way of really kind of dismissing the fact that there is a political basis to what they're doing. And another really interesting case is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which initially is deployed during the Quit India movement in 1942, but now continues to be used actually in Northeast India to deal with various insurgencies there, including the Naga and others. So we definitely can see that these, in a very practical way, these kind of legislative decisions as well as these kind of discursive shifts that we see within this earlier period, really do continue to exercise quite a bit of power today as well.
I just wanted to ask you, Joseph, and this is in some ways a factual question, that there was an amendment to the Unlawful Activities Prohibition Act last year, 2019, in India, which looked, very much like the Rowlatt Acts 100 years on. Excepting that, there have been many exceptions that have been made on the question of terrorism, where, someone who can be deemed to be a member of a terrorist association or organization is, liable to be, charged under that particular provision of the law. But what this particular amendment that was passed in 2019 seemed to suggest was that even an individual could be just proclaimed a terrorist without having to, say that this was someone who was a member of a terrorist association organization. Is there a precedent for that in any of the laws of exception that you've seen in, colonial India?
I'm off the top, I'm not sure kind of in very tangible terms, but I definitely, in terms of the kind of rationale behind it, I do think that a big part of this kind of shift towards this kind of shift towards between like terrorism as a verb to terrorist as a noun, I think is actually very tightly connected to that colonial history. And if we look at the deeper history there with like the anti-thug campaigns, I think are instructive on that, because there we do actually have a very similar kind of thing where someone could be identified as being a thug. It didn't matter whether they were identified as being connected to other so-called thugs or anything like that. At one point, one of the ways that they would identify them was just if it was someone who was kind of out in the woods and had a knotted piece of rope that they then thought they were going to use to strangle someone, that was enough to say, okay, this person is a thug. And regardless of them being tied to any actual murders or robberies, that then was considered enough to actually kind of prosecute them that way. So I think that it does definitely connect. In terms of the revolutionary conspiracies in the early 20th century, in terms of what I can recall, I believe that this idea of conspiracy is really important, and the idea of belonging to a criminal organization is important. I can't think of anywhere there was kind of an individual taken alone who was just, where they just said, this person is a terrorist, so we're going to try them on the basis of that. It tended to be on the basis of association with other, like criminal association, those kinds of things. But I do think that probably in terms of thinking about kind of tracing that back, I would definitely think about the thugs and then the whole like the Criminal Tribes Act and that whole kind of logic of almost, well, in that case, explicitly hereditary criminality, but thinking now about kind of, also if we think about the use of drones, I mentioned a little bit at the beginning of the book, this signature strike policy, which is based on identifying a person as basically appearing as a militant. So someone who is a man of fighting age carrying a gun. In some of the kind of frameworks, that's considered sufficient for establishing that they're a militant, rather than someone who's hunting animals. So I think there also, that also just does kind of remind me of that kind of how that works.
Yeah, I was listening to a seminar being given by Ben Hopkins yesterday at Tufts, where he was talking about Afghanistan and distant drone strikes and so forth. Before I let you go, especially given what's going on in Burma right now, I wonder if you would like to give us a very brief sort of preview of the comparative work that you're doing on democracy and emergency in India and Myanmar, and how that ties in, or how it is sort of a departure from the book that you've just published.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm really interested in the kind of borderlands area between the two countries in this period, kind of from the eve of independence with the Second World War, really right up until the present. But I mean, in terms of kind of where I've gotten so far, really only up until about the early 1960s. And this is what's interesting about this chronological period is it does actually work well as a distinct period in both places, because you have essentially the entirety of the Nehruvian period in India, and then within Burma, you have the entirety of the democratic period, kind of bookended that way. And so what I'm interested in with that is looking at how, as these new democratic states were emerging in both places, and were looking to kind of establish their own kind of legitimacy within this new world of nations, their own territorial control, and their own political authority and national identity. How this was complicated by this borderlands area on both sides, and how this kind of circulation of people, this kind of prevalence of groups that didn't really fit neatly into either country, how this posed problems for the initial post-colonial democracies, and then how, to what extent they kind of reached back then to these colonial laws of emergency as a way of trying to deal with these issues. And so thinking about what kinds of, are they using, are they immediately kind of resorting to a language of terrorism? Is it a different kind of language of insurgency? I've seen within the documents some kind of conversation about insurgency as well. So whether that is more kind of what's used, and then thinking about really taking this then within this area that is considered kind of peripheral to both countries within kind of many studies of each country on its own, thinking about to what extent this actually plays an important role in how at the center these new democracies are looking to establish themselves and to buttress their authority with these kind of very non-democratic laws that were kind of bequeathed by the previous colonial administrations.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to, since we have recorded this session, I'm going to encourage my students who are taking a course with me on what is imperial history to watch your talk. I mean, they, of course, have no difficulty in talking and asking lots of questions. In fact, they bombard me with questions and comments, but I didn't want to overburden them. They have their long tutorials on Thursdays, but this will be a very valuable resource for them, especially since you have placed your work on the prose of counterterrorism in the context of the transition from the world of empires to the world of nation states. And I think we are really very fortunate that in just the last few months we've had the publication of your supervisor, Tim Harper's book Underground Asia, and yours, A Genealogy of Terrorism. And that really helps us to better understand the cross-border forms of surveillance deployed by the late colonial state, and the efforts of the revolutionaries dubbed terrorists by the colonial powers to somehow evade those tentacles of being under watch and control. And I think your work contributes immeasurably to our understanding of colonial legal history, but also gives us a better understanding of the challenges which anti-colonial resistance had to face in this very crucial period during the last few decades of British rule in India and other parts of Asia and Africa. So I'd like to, thank you, Joseph, and I hope that we will, in the foreseeable future, find ourselves in a better world where, I can, welcome you at Harvard and across the border from Canada. And also, it would be a real pleasure to see you in Calcutta again, where I believe I met you in 2015 while you were engaged in research on this project. So once again, thank you very much, Joseph, and best wishes with your book. It really deserves to be very, very widely read by students and scholars of empire.
Thank you so much, Professor Bose, and I really look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you. Okay, bye everyone now, and an applause for Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.